Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show, where we help you make the wisest and most profitable decisions. My name is Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, the future of work consultancy that sponsors the Wise Decision Maker Show. And I'm joined today by Andrew. Andrew, can you please share a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Of course, it's great to be here. My name is Andrew Min. I lead technology and digital innovation at RXR. So RXR is about a $20 billion vertically integrated real estate investment manager, and we cover everything from office, multifamily residential, a little bit of single family residential, industrial, and infrastructure, kind of across the real estate spectrum.
Excellent. Now, I just had interviewed Peter Miskovich, the head of future of work at JLL, which obviously is also in real estate. He was telling me that generative AI adoption in the real estate space is embryonic. What's your perspective on that? What is your own approach to adopting generative AI? Where do you stand? What's your journey?
It's a great question. And I think that's exactly right, actually, at the industry
Mm,
level. And I think a big part of it, I think there's kind of two reasons for that, right? One is that the industry historically has not understood the need for something like generative
mm,
AI or more broadly technology, right? A lot of it has been built on sweat, right? Which is good. But it's sometimes taken a less systematic approach to solving problems than have
mm,
other asset classes like equities or other securities. Um, I'd say RXR has been a little bit different in that
mm,
respect, in two ways. One is we embraced quite some time ago, well before any of the kind of modern generative AI tools had come out, a belief that we needed to be more systematic in our decision-making processes. And in
mm,
order to do that, it required both data and then kind of collating, analyzing that data and
mm,
sharing it back to our teams in the form of insights, right? That are actually actionable, not just some pretty graphs and charts. And
mm,
so we'd actually started on this journey, back in 2018, 2019,
mm,
with a mix of two things, right? One was saying, what are the problems that exist in an organization
mm,
where technology could be useful, right? And I think that's one issue that a lot of companies today face, right? Which is they say,
mm,
Gen AI is really cool. What can I do with it? And it becomes a little bit of a
mm,
hammer looking for a nail
mm,
versus flipping it and saying, what are the problems in my organization?
mm,
And then working backwards, what are the appropriate technologies, whether they be
mm,
Gen AI or something completely different, like just a descriptive set of analytics that could solve this. The second thing is in the service of that,
mm,
we were very targeted about what data we collected. So ultimately,
mm,
our long-term vision was we want to collect a ton of data, have it all stored in a
mm,
clean data lake, and be able to use that data, right? Because the more data you
mm,
have, the more valuable it is. Where I've seen a lot of our peers fall down is they spend 3 years trying to collect data. Halfway
mm,
through, they kind of give up because they've never actually
mm,
figured out what to do with that data. And
mm,
there's a little bit of kind of paralysis by analysis. And so
mm,
instead, we were actually really targeted in the data we collected and said, okay, given the specific set of use cases, we're only
mm,
going to collect enough data to solve those use cases. And we did that in a scalable way, of course, and then we tacked on more and more data as we went. And so I
mm,
think, sitting here 6 years later, there are two things that I think are differentiated us and have allowed
mm,
us as a firm to use Gen AI. I think I would say probably much more than an average peer. One is the fact that we've been very clinical in trying to figure out
mm,
where it can be used rather than just saying we're a hammer looking for a nail. And the second is we've collected a very large data set in
mm,
a kind of well-organized data lake that kind of has laid the foundation for us to be able to
mm.
adopt Gen AI at scale versus other organizations that are just starting that journey.
Excellent. So I'm glad to hear that you're much further ahead than other organizations. Tell me a little bit about what you've done with generative AI adoption. Give me a little bit of use cases. What have you done? What are some examples? And then we'll dive into those use cases.
Of course. So a couple examples that I think are really interesting, right? And RXR as a firm, right, again, is vertically integrated. And
Mhm,
so there are a lot of even just opportunities to create value for a diverse set of stakeholders, right? And
mm,
so I'd kind of bucket it into three things. One is
mm,
how can we improve the customer experience for the people that live, work, and play and shop in our buildings? The second is how do we improve the financial performance for those assets? And then the
mhm,
third is how do we kind of just make the corporate experience and team member experience better and
mm,
more effective, right? And so I'll give a couple examples in each of those categories. On the customer experience side, a big piece of it has been leveraging kind of learnings and approaches from other industries
mhm,
to build best-in-class hospitality. So one example is trying to proactively work with our staff to understand what are moments that really matter to our residents, as an
Mhm.
example, in our apartment buildings, and help them understand what matters to them. So, for example, we did a lot of research analyzing the data we collected and so on to try to
Mhm.
figure out what makes residents feel loyal. And one piece of
Mhm.
that is when they feel known. And so a big driver of feeling known is small things like when they tell you their birthday, you remember a year later, right?
Mhm.
And maybe even buy them a small present, or even just something as
Mhm.
simple as saying happy birthday. Now, in a 200 unit building, that's very difficult for one resident manager to do, right?
Mhm.
And even if that person can do that, right, and has an amazing memory, at some point they're going to get promoted, right? And then you kind of start over. And so we built a very simple CRM that allows our team, and
Mhm.
it's very integrated into the workflows, that allows our team to kind of capture different pieces of information that residents tell
Mhm.
them, right? Like we're not going out and buying data about them. It's only things that
Mhm.
residents have told us, and then use predictive algorithms, right, to prompt the staff as to
Mhm.
one, when there's a moment of surprise and delight coming, like a birthday, a building anniversary, a pet birthday, or some other meaningful moment that they
Mhm.
told us about, and also use AI to recommend what might work well. So, for example, if a year
Mhm.
ago you bought them a cake and they say, that is so nice. I'm actually trying to do low sugar. Maybe it'll remind you of that and say, hey, actually, we don't recommend doing this next time, right?
Mhm.
There's a second version. So that's one way that's kind of like very proactive and I think highlights also the importance of AI is not this kind of black box thing that interacts like a
Mhm.
robot in a corner. It's best used when it's paired with our vertically integrated teams, right? And when it empowers people. And I think another really good example of that is, we have a proprietary messaging platform. And we get, again, in our residential portfolio, as an
Mhm.
example, thousands of messages every day from our residents. And some are
Mhm.
complaints, some are work orders, some are compliments, or some are even just questions like, do you have a brunch recommendation in the area I'm
Mhm.
new? One of the things that we do is we run a natural language processing algorithm that we built on top of all those messages, and we
Ah.
calculate the sentiment score. So is it a positive or
Mhm.
negative message? If positive, how positive, negative, how message. And then we also run it through an LLM that tells us what the topic was, right? Is it about
Mhm.
parking? Is it about the trash, right? Is it about a
Mhm.
water leak? Is it about just a local recommendation? And then we use that to figure out what are people talking to us about and what are
Mhm.
trends in sentiment. So in real time, I can say, oh, this building is usually really satisfied. It's trending down. And then we use AI again to kind of
Mhm.
to analyze the data and create predictive alerts
Mhm.
that say, hey, there's a problem with this
Mhm.
building. You've gotten a ton of negative sentiment messages, and they all seem to be about parking, right? And then that
Mhm.
actually has allowed us to do things like go out and figure out there was a water leak at one of our buildings, and we
Mhm.
centrally figured it out even before the on-site teams knew about it. Or even some things, you can't always control them, right? Like one time there was a
Sure.
blackout, and so we needed to communicate to our residents. And so it kind of proactively prompted us to say, we need to tell our residents that there's a blackout so they're not freaked out and
Mhm.
don't understand what's going on, right? So that's a couple examples on the resident
Mhm.
experience
Mhm.
side.
Mhm.
On the performance side, I think, there's a number of things that we're doing, but I think the most interesting one we're looking at is we use predictive algorithms, collecting all of the data that we
Mhm.
collect to try to figure out what are the drivers of what makes someone more likely to renew so that we can
Mhm.
emphasize those things because we use renewals as a proxy for satisfaction, right? At the end of the day, if you keep
Sure.
on wanting to stay at our buildings, that implies you're really happy living in our buildings, right? And so one really good example of that is we looked at one of the inputs that we collected was amenity data, right? Amenity usage
Mhm.
data. Many developers would put in gyms or co-working spaces and whatnot. Again, as an example in the residential portfolio, we're doing this in other sectors too, um, to say, oh, and they'll say, oh, this is really important. People love using the gym.
Mhm.
And when you ask them for the evidence of that, it's usually anecdotal, right? And so what
Mhm.
we actually did was we went in and we said, among other things, do people that use our amenities more, are they more likely to renew? And it
Ah.
was really
Mhm.
interesting. At one building in particular, there were some amenities where it actually had no correlation to
Ah.
renewal. There may be amenities that people liked, but they didn't see them as differentiated. Maybe most buildings have these
Mhm.
amenities. The gym actually at this building, though, in downtown Brooklyn, was highly correlated to renewal rates. So
Mhm.
there was almost a linear
Mhm.
correlation between you are more likely to use the gym, you are more likely to renew. And then there were some that were really distinct. So there's one building in New Rochelle that has this, we call it a speakeasy, and it's like a hidden door, and you open it up, and it's this beautiful event space. And we often
Hmm.
host building events there. And there is a disproportionate, an exponential correlation between
Hmm.
people that use that space and are more likely to renew. And so that's helped us with a couple things. Sometimes it says
Hmm.
we should really be thoughtful about the capex and invest it in
Yeah.
special spaces, right? Or it's not just a CapEx decision, right? We realized that at this building in downtown Brooklyn, there are a lot of fitness enthusiasts and they love our building. And so
Hmm.
we're saying, let's lean into that. And so
Hmm.
we do more resident programming centered around fitness now as a result of
Hmm.
this, right? And so you don't even necessarily have to spend more money. It's just
Hmm.
being more efficient about how you spend that money so that residents get happier about
Hmm.
it, right? And so another good example is it turns out the biggest predictor of non-renewal is if you've had an extended period of time for your work orders to get closed out, right? And
Hmm. Sure.
sometimes, right, it's not something we can control, right? Sometimes a part's on back order and so on.
Hmm.
But what we've started doing as a result of that is again using AI. We'll prompt our teams to message residents because we want our teams to kind of be front and center here, to
Hmm.
feel like they have a personal connection with the resident.
Hmm.
And the teams will go out and message the resident and say, hey, just so you know, I know you've been waiting a couple of days. We are still working on this. Here's the reason why it's
Hmm.
on back order, right? And
Hmm.
so that the resident feels like they have some sort of transparency.
Hmm.
It's not just a black box where they have to check in every couple of days. We're proactively reaching out to them because of our algorithm, kind of making this
Hmm.
recommendation and saying, hey, it's time to let the resident know what's going on because you haven't told them anything in the last couple of days. Um, and then the last one, kind of, I mentioned just improving efficiencies for our teams, right?
Hmm.
So there's a couple of ways we do this. A big piece of what we do, right? As you can tell, a large part of our secret sauce is we empower our team members, right? That our
Hmm.
team members
Hmm.
are the front line customer experience and
Hmm.
ask performance folks. Um, and a large part of that's through training, right? And
Hmm.
historically, training is really hard to scale. Either you have someone who's really good at training people,
Hmm.
but unfortunately, they end up spending all of their time training and don't have time to do their day job.
Sure.
Or you kind of do recorded videos and they're not that
Hmm.
interactive. And one of the things that we started doing has been using kind of interactive avatars. And so we'll write
Hmm.
up a training script, we'll put together slides, and it'll actually generate an overlay of a person on top of it who kind of feels a little more interactive.
Hmm.
Feels like you're almost watching a
Hmm.
webinar with a real person versus just a recorded video or
Hmm.
or a set of slides that someone's reading off of a script. And you've seen actually even just as a result that like the amount of staff engagement, and even just
Hmm.
from an outcomes perspective, they're
Hmm.
clearly internalizing it better as a
Oh.
result. Um, or even basic things like we're leveraging a lot of the kind of image generation or video
Hmm.
generation, generative AI tools to make our content pop a lot more, right? And people just find
Hmm.
that really compelling. And the last example, kind of a little more on the investor side, is a lot of times we'll get due diligence questionnaires, right?
Hmm.
About maybe risk profiles, risk protocols, or IT protocols, or our track record, right? Like kind of
Hmm.
questions that investors generally always ask. And
Yeah.
they're all, many of them are similar questions, but maybe worded slightly differently. And, we have a team that historically their job has been they go back through all the old Word documents that they filled out
Hmm.
before, and they try to search for all the keywords like, oh, there's a
Hmm.
question about cybersecurity, and they type in cybersecurity, but maybe in the past they answered it with IT security, so they can't find it. And so what we've done now is we've actually built in-house a tool that
Hmm.
collates all our past responses and then uses generative AI, one to search through all our past responses and try to find ones not based on keywords, but based on
Hmm.
like the actual content that is most similar using reasoning, and then recommend those answers. You can actually pull up the original
Hmm.
document so you know that it's not hallucinating, and then
Hmm.
crafts a recommended answer for you. So you go from
Hmm.
spending hours and sometimes days trying to answer these questions to in a click of a button, you have a fully baked questionnaire response. So those are just some of the ones that we
Hmm.
work with.
No, that's excellent. Those are some great examples. I'm curious about, you mentioned during some of your examples how you're measuring the outcome. So can you tell me a little bit more about the metrics they're using? I imagine you're using both metrics that evaluate usage of generative AI and the kind of outcomes you're getting from it. So tell me a little bit more about your approach, just kind of your mentality, your thinking about how to use metrics to evaluate generative AI usage itself to evaluate the kind of outcomes that you're getting? And tell me a little bit more about the outcomes themselves. You mentioned kind of a little bit more about like, oh, they've improved, let's say, retention, the ability. Tell me a little bit more about the actual outcomes, but also just how you're measuring things.
Of course. So it's a really good question, right? And I think it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, which is it
Hmm.
has to be business case driven and use case
Yeah.
driven, right? And so we actually start by saying, what is the business problem you're trying to solve? And so, for
Hmm.
example, it's I want to figure out how to spend money more effectively on amenities from a capital perspective. And so we say, okay, well, why are we putting in amenities in the first place, right? And the answer ultimately is because people like them, and if they like them, they're more likely to renew. So we said, okay,
Hmm.
so then our outcome variable must be renewals, right? That is the ultimate kind of
Yeah.
answer. Now, of course, renewals only happen once a year, right? And so, and there are other reasons people don't renew. So you need to make sure you can build a kind of
Hmm.
a broad machine learning model that's able to take all of that
Hmm.
into
Hmm.
account. But if you isolate down to controllable renewals, as an example, and then maybe you also pick intermediate variables. So, for example, sentiment, which I mentioned earlier, is
Hmm.
actually a really good proxy for renewals. If you're very unhappy, you're very unlikely to renew, right? And if you're very happy, you're much more likely to renew, unless it's something
Hmm.
like a job or job relocation or something like that. And so we pick those outcome variables based on the business question, right? Then we say,
Hmm.
okay, how can we use generative AI or whatever, right? Descriptive analytics or even
Hmm.
just an off-the-shelf software program to improve those variables, right? And we set up a
Hmm. Hmm.
hypothesis and then we actually measure it, right? And we go back and look and say, okay, did retention change? And based on a machine learning model, do we think it changed because of these practices we put in place
Hmm.
or other ways, right?
Hmm.
And I think that's kind of like the gold standard, right? But
Yeah.
again, renewals happen once a year, so it takes a while to do that. In between, we rely on kind of two intermediate sources. One is we do, to the extent we can, we do try to survey or collect feedback from
Hmm.
residents in real time or customers in real time, whether they're residents or office workers or whatnot. And that's a mix of these surveys, but also kind of monitoring sentiment and saying, okay, is it changing as a result of this, positively or negatively? And then the other thing is we really rely on our team members, right? I think one
Hmm.
of the things that's really interesting is I mentioned again this renewal model concept where we kind of say, hey,
Hmm.
like, why are people renewing? It's interesting because one of the things we said was, hey, I wonder what would happen if we asked our team members if they think that certain people are going to renew.
Hmm.
And it turns out that they're extremely accurate at predicting whether or
Hmm.
not people are going to renew, like these property staff, right? Because they talk to these residents, they know these residents. And so that's created a lot of predictive power.
Hmm.
And so one of the things
Hmm.
that we already intuitively knew, but we can also empirically prove, is that our staff are really good at telling us if something's working. And
Hmm.
so a lot of it, frankly, is also working with our team members on the properties to make sure that whatever we're rolling out that we think is good for our residents or our office employees or our shoppers, that they actually think so as well. And if they don't, they're probably right.
Hmm. So let's talk a little bit about your team members. Now, I know that in a number of contexts, team members are somewhat hesitant about AI. There's a lot of fear, there's a lot of anxiety about AI and job displacement. And so, what did you do to address such concerns, which I'm sure were there at RXR as there are at other places? And how did you get team members to engage more effectively with generative AI tools?
It's a great question. So again, I think probably the number one thing is we've been doing this well before generative AI became a hot
Hmm.
topic, right? Like we've really invested heavily in this since 2018, 2019. And when we did it, we actually never had the hypothesis that using technology or data or nascent AI at the time was going to lead to substantial job reduction, right? And
Hmm.
part of the reason for that is we ultimately believe that our team members at RXR are a secret sauce, right?
Hmm.
What we believed though was sometimes they didn't have all the information they needed to make systematic
Hmm.
decisions. Sometimes information existed in silos, so departments weren't able to collaborate as effectively, or they were spending a lot of time doing rote tasks, right? And
Hmm.
so our thesis has always been that technology, not just generative AI,
Hmm.
but technology writ large, would free up time
Hmm.
and give our team members information that they needed to make better and smarter
Hmm.
decisions, and frankly spend more time making better and smarter decisions rather than doing paperwork, right? And so
Hmm.
I actually think people have really resonated with that. And so actually, I don't really hear any fear at all from people.
Mm,
And I'm sure there's a little bit of it, but I hear very rarely people saying, well, I don't want to use generative AI because I'm worried it'll take away my job. Because they've already
mm,
seen that's not how we think about technology at
mm,
RXR, because they've adopted technology that our teams have rolled
mm,
out and they've seen it just makes their job better, right? I'd say the other thing is we're very collaborative, right? I think the
mm,
biggest mistake technology teams make, especially around AI, but in general as well, is they sit in a room and they think about what they think the coolest technologies would be, and then they go out and try
mm,
to force everyone to use it. And
mm,
again, we're really use case driven. So we go and
mm,
embed in these teams, and we sit with the construction team or the
mm,
residential leasing team or the office, workplace experience team. And we say, and we really try to understand the
mm,
problems that they're facing today, and how we can surprise and delight them, and how we can solve their pain points. And then we really iterate with them on the solutions. We don't just kind of go away for 6 months
mm,
and build something or procure something and then come back to them and say, here it is,
mm,
go use it. We make sure they're embedded in the entire design process from the beginning to the
mm,
end. And so as a result, they feel like they're owners, right? They don't feel like something's
mm,
being foisted upon them. And I think as a result, people have kind of come to see more and more value. I think the last one too, by the
mm,
way, is people are using AI more in their day-to-day lives.
mm,
And I think you saw this a little bit with mobile, even right, like
mm,
10 years ago, when people started calling taxis and booking hotels and booking
mm,
airplanes and shopping, right, using a phone, it just made them more and more likely to expect that their landlords would let them pay rent with their phone,
mm,
and reserve work orders,
mm,
request work orders or book amenities. And I think similarly here, the adoption to some
mm,
extent follows consumer, or even, emails kind of like that, right? Where, as people adopted Gmail, they got more comfortable with the
mm,
idea of cloud, of hosted email, right, rather than email you
mm,
download. And I think that similarly here, right, as people use ChatGPT in
mm,
their day-to-day lives and realize that it's super useful in their day-to-day lives, they're a lot more comfortable saying, okay, I don't necessarily know how I'd use AI in my
mm,
day-to-day job, but I'm interested in finding out.
mm. Now, when you're talking about getting engaged with various stakeholders on generative AI, it makes me think about issues, and you mentioned hallucinations earlier, around risk management and AI governance. How did you develop your risk management, compliance, ethics, AI governance policies? What are they in broad terms, and how are you thinking about them?
It's a great question. So obviously it's still evolving, right? Because the
Yeah.
space is still evolving. But what I would say is it's 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 kind of a couple of metrics of success. One
Mhm,
is we involve it's a top-down mandate, right?
mhm,
The our enterprise technology committee I help lead, but it's
mhm,
chaired by RXR's vice chairman and chief legal officer.
mhm,
And then it's also so there's a top-down mandate of this is really important and we all need to kind
mhm,
of get on board. The members of the committee, right, have representation from every single department, and they're all senior
mhm,
members. Most of them are senior VPs or above. And so it's something that all the departments take really seriously and participate in.
mhm,
Again, I think it goes back to the idea of feeling a level of ownership over the answer
mhm,
rather than outsourcing it to the technology department. That being said, of course, we have an enterprise IT department. They do, have an enterprise risk checklist and a
mhm,
cybersecurity checklist that you have to pass, in order to use technology, in order to use any, especially generative AI,
mhm,
given the risks of data being shared back to the provider. There's a
mhm,
pretty strict policy around making sure that a special AI committee signs off on it. That's really
mhm,
well briefed. Um, but yeah, I think the short answer is making sure that all the departments are bought in so that it's not just
mhm,
a really well-crafted policy that no one follows, but one that
mhm.
that is really embedded in the core of the company.
Excellent. Now, as we finish up, where do you see your usage of generative AI going in the next couple of years as we get more and more agentic AI and it levels up and is able to replace more and more human tasks?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, and I think, by the way you phrased it is exactly right, which is generative AI is going to replace tasks, not jobs.
Mhm,
Kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier. Similar to how computers replace tasks, not jobs, right? We still have people employed. They just do other things rather than writing
mhm,
with paper and a pencil. But I think to answer your question, all of the or many of what I've described are analyses that a specific department is asking with a data set they've historically looked at. So our asset
Mhm.
manager are asking about how do I target my CapEx spend more
Mhm.
effectively, and they're looking at kind of their pricing data and usage data and so on. Or the experience team is asking how do I understand how what makes people what is
Mhm.
driving sentiment right at my buildings.
Mhm.
Um, and I think as these data silos continue to get knocked down and these tools continue to cross departments and cross these
Mhm.
silos, I think you're going to get less of the how do I answer questions you're already
Mhm.
answering, and now how do I start asking new questions? I think
Mhm.
that's one. The other one that I think is really interesting is historically we have built most of what we're talking about. So I lead a
Mhm.
team of it's about 10 software engineers, data scientists, product managers, right? Mostly folks that came from venture-backed startups. And that was partially, that was a big reason how we got our start, right? Which is that we
Mhm.
had, a Silicon Valley quality team building a
Mhm.
lot of this technology up front. One of the things we're actually really excited about, because obviously that's led to us being spread really thin, is that there's this new wave of no code or low code AI tools that are
Mhm.
coming out, right? Like even something as simple as, to use an example, a lot of people understand ChatGPT Enterprise, right? But there's all sorts of kind of more generic
Mhm.
general purpose tools that
Mhm.
like a Glean, for example, or even like in the alternative space like a Hebbia, that allows people to start defining their own questions and building their own answers, right? Like some of them will even let you
Mhm.
build their own apps without knowing how to write code. I think that's really exciting because I don't
Mhm.
think these general purpose tools are are going to solve really, really specific domain specific requirements. So teams like my team are still going to be needed to solve those
Mhm.
very specific requirements. But I do think they're going to solve a lot of these general purpose requirements.
Mhm.
And so I'm excited to empower, and RXR is excited to empower our team members and kind of create this wave of almost like
Mhm.
other firms call them citizen developers who don't
Mhm.
necessarily need to know how to code, but understand how to ask the right questions, which hopefully we've coached
Mhm.
them on through this kind of process over the years so that they're empowered to go out and solve a lot of those themselves. I almost think of it as like you like in the real estate context, you still need
Mhm.
Argus for underwriting. It's a very domain specific set of requirements. But in general, people use Excel to solve a lot of their
Mhm.
general purpose questions, right? And I think that's kind of where the industry is moving and where the world is moving. That's something we're really excited about and where we're spending a lot of our time and money.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. This was super helpful. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise.
Of course, thank you for having me on.
And thank you to the audience for checking out another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. Please make sure to subscribe wherever you checked out the show and leave a review. It helps other people discover the show and helps us improve the show. And if you have any questions, email me at gleb, Gleb, at disasteravoidanceexperts.com.